Hey everyone, welcome and thank you for joining us for Gender in the Workplace conversation on communication bias. If you are a gender equity advocate or curious, you can't miss this conversation. Rarely discussed but powerful communication biases perpetuate gender inequality in many workplaces. For example, why is one person described as aggressive by some and assertive by others? And how do these biases impact their ability to deliver? We will be discussing this topic, amongst others, with an aim to give you tools and ideas on how you can improve your workplace. We'll be exploring this with our gender equity advocates, Joe Plummer, Phil Diver, and Scott Brown. So, welcome, Joe, Phil, and Scott. Lovely to have
Hello.
you.
Amazing to be here. Thanks, Lisa, for the opportunity.
So let's begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we join today's meeting. For me, it's the Wathaurong people. Can I ask any of you to add yours into the chat? And on our behalf, I pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and future. And in the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and their connections to the land, sea, and community. And I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. We extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. So, welcome to Phil. He is the CEO of the Construction Training Centre based in Queensland, which inhabits a predominantly male domain of construction and has for many years introduced progressive policies to show leadership and demonstrate what small businesses are capable of. A person of vision, Phil has spearheaded initiatives such as the Living Laboratory concept and hot leasing and is committed to developing a business model that continues to deliver value to the industry. He's proud to have defeated QCAT to earn the right to pay 50% of his staff, the women, more superannuation than their male counterparts. So well done, Phil, and welcome.
Thank you.
Can you share with us briefly why you're so passionate about gender equity and give us a sneak peek at what you're working on?
I like equity because I don't like equality, I suppose is the kind of simplest way of saying that. But if I look at my career, and I haven't got to very lofty heights, but when I look at my career, everybody that moves through an organization or moves through their work life does it, I think, standing on the shoulders of giants. And in my case, just as the way it's panned out, most of those giants have been women. So for me, it's really just about paying some of that back. And so that's really why I'm passionate about gender issues.
I think we can't hear you, Lisa. There you go.
And we know that Phil was actually nominated for a Gender Equity Award and was very proud to attend the night with his daughter.
That was a great night. What I'm working on at the moment, we're working on what we call a red and blue agenda. So the red agenda is looking to raise awareness and deal with the sick leave issues, absenteeism around endometriosis and severe period pain. And the blue agenda is dealing with men and prostate health and how we might deal with the sort of sick leave implications of that. And I'm just thinking, and it's just an idea, and if anyone's got any feedback, please let me know, of maybe differentially providing different sick leave to men and women. But I have to go back to QCAT and win that in court as well. The other thing we're working on at the moment, which is a communication issue, because this is all about communication, is trying to educate our students and the people that come to our site, who are mainly in construction, around trans-friendly language and get them to not be so hysterical, because we've got a trans-inclusive toilet. And we're also building a specialist communication lab where we can put people into complex communication scenarios and film them and then give them feedback. So that's on our agenda at the moment.
Wow, sounds like some great initiatives. Let me move on to our next guest. Joe Plummer is currently the chair for Barwon Water, Barwon Asset Solution, and the deputy chair for the Country Fire Authority. She's an Australian Institute of Company Directors Master and Fellow and holds an MBA in majoring in leadership, communication, strategy and planning. So welcome, Jo.
Thank you, Lise.
Nice to have you here. So can you share with us briefly why you're so passionate about gender equity?
It's a great question, isn't it? We've all got our own stories to tell, but for me, you know, and you've heard me say this before, no matter where you're born in the world, what race, what religion, what colour, if you're born anything other than a healthy male, then you will lead a life of inequality to varying degrees, and that doesn't sit well with me. And so I think certainly creating an environment where women in particular are able to fully participate in society, whether that's through leadership, decision-making roles, economically, politically, all of those things, and in particular making decisions, we know that actually we get better outcomes and performance from doing that, and there's plenty of data to support that. And then, you know, what's topical on our minds at the moment is the vulnerability piece that women find themselves in. And when women don't share in the financial spoils with men, and when they're not at the action end, we know that they are far more vulnerable and less able to have opportunity and choice to move out of relationships that aren't healthy for them.
Very true. Well, good answer, Jo. And our last panelist to be introduced is Scott Brown. Now, Scott has a very extensive title, so I'm going to give you the abridged version. Scott brings a lifelong experience in both corporate and as a serial entrepreneur, spanning across multiple industries, too many to list, and he reflects his experience across his portfolio of board roles, also a very large list. So we've got an incredible panel of people. So welcome, Scott. It's lovely to have you here. Can you explain why you're so passionate about gender equity?
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you for the opportunity to participate. Yeah, look, I think my motivation probably is heightened by an experience of ridiculous level of awkwardness in the face of trying to determine how I feel and how I think in the space amongst the plethora of other opinions and experiences that I've witnessed as a young man and growing up, and being in so many different businesses, in so many different organisations, from Fortune 500 subsidiary right back to a early stage startup and everything in between. Those different arenas and amphitheatres make it quite a different experience, even though it might be the same theme or the same agenda in terms of gender equity. And Phil, I applaud your use of the word equity because I happen to agree with that, because men and women are different as opposed to being the same, but different doesn't mean less or more equal. So that's kind of where I come from. I think, Lisa, probably the awkwardness aspect of it has enabled me, initially I've made a lot of mistakes and tumbled and fumbled my way through, not knowing how to go about it. But seeing other people who are excellent in this space has helped me to actually recognise what great looks like. And that's given me more courage to actually step into that space and to advocate for it. And also to give other people permission, not necessarily to be perfect at it. You can believe in something even if you're not necessarily highly polished at it. And so, that's pretty much my role. And I think it's exemplified, if I may, Lisa, I think we were talking about this the other day. Some significant number of years ago, I had one of my businesses that I built was in landscape architecture and construction. Obviously, particularly the construction aspect male dominated. Landscape architecture in terms of the office and design, a little bit more evenly spread, even many, many years ago. But still, the juncture between those two within the one business was quite awkward and difficult to manage. And so in, I guess, my naivety, second day after hiring a young lady, a landscape architect graduate with the company, she was having some difficulty on the drawing boards, but it was before CAD design in those days, in terms of reconciling what needed to be specified on the documents, the bill of quantities for the construction. So I decided on the spur of the moment to take her with me to visit a building site so we could look and see what it actually looks like to put those plans into practice. So we just jumped in my car and took off from Brighton, where the office was, around to Williamstown. And we were on the building site for a number of hours. And then we left there and went to another site to measure or take some measurements to do some surveying for another project. The day got away from us and we just lost track of the day trying to get so much done. And it was getting dark and we sort of thought we better head home. And this was her second day on the job in the office. And we're driving through Williamstown and I decided I was absolutely starving and hungry. And I said, "Do you want to get something to eat?" And she said, "Sure." And there was a little bit of hesitation in her voice. And I just thought, well, maybe she's not hungry or whatever it is. Anyway, could not find a takeaway food place in Williamstown. They're all restaurants in those days. So pulled up in the main traffic parking area and walked into an Italian restaurant. And ended up with a table, a candlelit table, in a nice little intimate restaurant. And so I was sweating and profusely and quite concerned. Anyway, we had a reasonably, it was an enjoyable meal. And I thought it was okay, but I felt a bit uncomfortable. I didn't know how to deal with it or to address it. Got home, dropped Kim back off at the office for her to grab her car to go home. Got home. Obviously, I'd let my wife know that I was going to be late and not home for dinner. Anyway, when I got home, she asked how things went. I told her, and she said straight away, she said, "So did you address the conversation? Did you pre-frame that to start with, that it was just a work, was she comfortable?" She said, "I bet you didn't make her feel comfortable." And so I had all these second guesses about the night. And so I sort of went to work the next day a bit sheepishly, sort of waiting to see what sort of I might walk into. Anyway, she was great. She was fantastic. I think she picked up on the fact that I was a little bit awkward and I didn't know quite what to do. She didn't perceive any sort of threat or danger. And in fact, she took it upon herself to remind me of that incident in the subsequent years that she worked for me. But we've ended up really close friends, invited to their engagement, invited to their wedding, and also the birth of her twin children. So from that point of view, it worked out really well. But it could have gone anywhere depending on her level of flexibility and maturity, because I didn't really do a great job. So I think that sort of set the precedent for me to be a little bit more aware of it and to make an effort, even if I don't quite know what to do, just to actually admit that and say it.
And I think you're not alone there, Scott. I hear from people all the time saying that this, as it's got more debated, is a conversation that people struggle to have. And we hope that by doing these webinars that people will feel a little bit more comfortable to, move beyond awkward and actually just start being involved in the conversation. So let's explore an example of communication bias. To set the scene, it covers numerous different interactions that happen in business and societies. These behaviours range from interruption patterns and speaking time, contributions in meetings, assumptions based on parental status, and encouragement bias, just to name a few. So what we plan to do is discuss each scenario and explore different ways our panellists might handle this. So we thought we might start with interruption bias. Phil, you've got a really interesting theory that overly controlling communication is limiting female participation. Can you explain your thoughts?
Yeah, look, I've got this developing theory that a lot of the really laid down golden rules of management, if you kind of scratch the surface of that, are actually written by white middle class men. And so we almost have to challenge every single one of those. But the way we kind of evolved in our organization, we're 50% female, 50% male, is I found our team meetings were starting to, if you like, sort of become chaotic, and then having to bring some order to that, when in fact had to reframe that to go, well, it's not really chaos. It's maybe a different communication style that is the more laminar, one person speaks at a time, very strong chair, maintaining the meeting. The minute taker is very clear about, what went on, is not overly conducive to maybe what, from an evolutionary biology point of view, might be a more preferred communication style for some women. You can't just generalize, but And then we found that we're actually getting better value, particularly as new staff members came on. That kind of cross-talk that can happen when you make it more fluid makes it easier for those who might otherwise feel they're not kind of included, or they're less forthright in speaking up. So I found that, but that was also based on observing my son and my daughter. And you should always be wary of a scientific sample of one, but picking my son and his mates up from school dances, and my daughter and her friends at school dances, just the level of volume and cross communication happening in one car, but in the other just grunting, and one texting from the back to the front. And I think
no prizes for guessing which was which.
and if I start to think about some of the really big stuff ups in board meetings, and my classic examples is Wesfarmers deciding to go into the UK with Bunnings, and around the same time Woolworths deciding to take Bunnings on in Australia with a company called Masters. I sort of think that maybe the reason why that board sat around and agreed that, and there were some pretty smart people on that board, Virginia Westacott was on there and so forth, was maybe there wasn't that kind of cross communication fluid happening, where one might say to the other, do you really think this is a good idea? And they go, actually, no, because everyone sits there one at a time. It's your time to talk. You talk and you think, I think everyone else thinks it's a good idea. I won't actually raise my concerns. And that's probably more for women, thinking about the fact that there's this kind of general thing with women in the workforce, which I think science has shown, is that when a woman starts, you're presumed to be incompetent, and you earn your competence. And when a man starts, you're presumed to be competent, and you earn your incompetence. And if we were just more kind of fluid in the way we kind of do these things, I mean, who made these bloody rules up anyway? That idea of sometimes if it gets bad, somebody passes a spoon around and the person who's holding the spoon gets to talk. For me, there's a way more sophisticated communication style that we're not actually embracing. And as a result of that, we're not getting good ideas, and we're not getting things that help us avoid risk, which I think is coming back to your point, Joe. So that's kind of where my thinking has been at.
Awesome. And that's really interesting, Phil, because, the interruption bias that happens a lot is where women are often talked over. And so the idea of coming back to a very process driven is more about giving everyone airtime. But if at the end of it, people are then playing to the norms, it's not necessarily giving us the outcome we want. So, Joe, as a seasoned chair, have you witnessed interruption biases, or have you seen this scenario that Phil's describing, and what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, so I've got a slightly different view. I think, we all have various personalities, male or female, and some of us are louder and, more assertive than others. And I do think having somebody who is chairing a meeting can be really helpful, provided they're agile and provided they are bringing in those quieter voices, like more deliberately. And when perhaps someone hasn't, quite finished their conversation, or what I see more often is, a female making a softly spoken female making a point, and someone waits till a millisecond after they finish their last letter and then makes a different point, right? So it never actually lands. And so, making sure that we say, well, hang on just a minute, have we thought through what X person just said? Let's just play with that for a minute before we move somewhere else. And to the idea of, everyone sort of falling into line with one idea, one other little thing that I've kind of learned along the way is to make sure that I always ask someone who I know will have a view first up, what's your view, but then purposefully say, and who would like to share a counter view? And let's unpack those together so that we can actually really somewhere meet in the middle. So seen it lots of times. There are a few little tips and tools that we can use to help that along. But yeah, a lot of it's to do with personality, and I think having a strong, not so much chair, but facilitation piece, and maybe sharing that around.
Yeah, great points there, Joe. Scott, what are your thoughts?
It's interesting. I agree with Joe's observations there, and having been a board member on 2 boards of which Joe was chair, I can testify that what she says is what she practices. So that agility, that ability to be aware of the various personalities, not just pure gender divisions around the table, but the different personalities, and to cater for those, to include those that perhaps aren't as forthright, and then also not to be stepping on those that are naturally a little bit more extrovert, but to be balancing that out. Takes a fair bit of capacity, a fair bit of ability for a chair. I think that in terms of my experience across, a very, very wide range of sizes of organisations, not just culture, I think Phil's point around that fluidity, I love that word, the fluidity, is probably easier to achieve in smaller teams, in smaller organisations where there's a little bit more personality and personal relationship usually allowed. In a larger organisation, by necessity, we have a little bit more rigid structure involved, whether it be organisational, hierarchical, whatever it might be. It becomes a little bit more necessary in larger organisations. So it perhaps can be a little bit more challenging to try and impose that fluidity and to allow it to flourish. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try, and I think that Phil's idea and suggestion and the way in which he's obviously managing to oversee that is to be supported and applauded. But I think Joe's point about it being very much a case of cutting your cloth according to the situation, the company, the culture, the type of industry, the personalities in the room, the experience and the maturity of those involved, I think play a major role.
Yeah, thanks for that, Scott. And also there's a whole lot of lobbying that often goes on or should go on before a meeting where, counter views are often, tabled so that it doesn't become a slam dunk necessarily in the meeting. But to wrap up, Phil, what would you consider to be a better way of achieving that fluidity that you were looking for?
Well, to sort of pick up on Joe's point, how do you actually, I guess the fluidity is the mechanism to try and get better participation. But I really like Amy Cuddy's work, so her book Presence, because we come into a meeting, the communication we all know is going to be primarily non-verbal. So I do it myself before board meetings. I will go and I'll do, if it's going to be a tough board meeting, I'm doing a bit of shadow boxing and raising my arms as though I've won a gold medal. And I think if people are not familiar with Amy Cuddy's work, it's worthwhile actually looking at some of her YouTube clips. And so bring a physical presence first, because men particularly are more likely to bring that physical presence. And I think to be able to at least take that physical imbalance, asymmetry off the table around the board meeting first, you're building up confidence anyway, and that gives you that kind of idea to actually start. And there's a lot of stuff that can be done around it, your physical presence, about when to lean in, when to lean out, and all of those sorts of things. But I come back to this notion also of, let's just challenge the norms of management. I think now with AI and everything else, we just need to challenge what we always thought were the golden rules, the Bible or the Quran or what have you. And I've noticed that if you pick up some management books written by men, and I'm not anti-men, I'm a man, but if you look at Stephen Covey or Jeffrey Pfeffer, or if you look at Jim Collins, they're actually kind of laminar. And in a VUCA world, we're sort of moved away from that. And you look at Amy C. Edmondson, which is the Fearless Organization. You look at Brené Brown, Rosabeth Moss-Kanter. They're more complex. They're more rich. They're more dynamic. And I think, maybe let's start embracing some different ideas that are coming from different places.
Love it. And that's exactly why we're doing these webinars, to get some of these ideas out. So long reading list there, I think, for most of us. Sounds good. So let's move on and consider our second scenario on assuming authority. And this is where people often see people and assume on the basis just of first impressions who's in charge or who's not. Joe, can you share with us a situation that you've experienced and explain how you felt?
Yeah, look, I think this happens a lot. And certainly, many years ago, I was a young woman, I assumed it was because of see Lisa's laughing because she knows I've just had a birthday. So I do think that people assume potentially that you're not senior, right? So that there is this bias towards hierarchy and so forth. And as you rightly point out, Phil, men have a natural presence, and that certainly contributes to that feeling. But I unfortunately came to realise that actually hierarchy has very little to do with it. And in fact, just in the last couple of years, as I've moved into more senior roles like chairing boards and the like, and where I've accompanied, a male CEO to a particular meeting and have, been talking or asking questions, and often the answers are battered straight back to my male counterpart, even though I will be the one asking the question. And it does make you feel a little like a handbag, and certainly irrelevant, right? And so, there's a number of ways to deal with that, and I'm sure we'll come to that, but it's certainly not a nice feeling. And you need to have your resilience sort of head on, sort of to keep that conversation moving in the right direction.
Thanks for sharing that, Jo. I mean, we could cite numerous examples and continue on with this, but let's explore how we could deal with it. So, Phil, can you share with us some ideas you have on how this could be avoided or dealt with?
It's almost like you need an observational coach to be in those situations, observe and then give feedback. So people actually learn that, because that's probably a subconscious bias that's in there that actually needs a lot of work. So really interesting. If people want to give an example about how that works, there's two Stanford University researchers, senior professors, more or less at the same time, actually changed genders. So there was a neuroscientist who went from female to male, and a evolutionary biologist who went from male to female. Now, what happened was the only way to explain what happened to them was gender. So the person that became male was doing presentations, science papers, and things like that, and found their reception. They were getting noticed more. People were acknowledging their work, and somebody was overheard saying they were really good and way better than and way smarter than their sister. They clearly didn't have a sister, but obviously it's just through that pure lens. And in the other way around, the person that transitioned to female found themselves exactly what you're saying, Jo, really not taken seriously, and they thought it was humorous for a while, and it became absolutely tedious.
Yeah.
So I think we have to do a lot more work, and I think as owners, as managers and leaders, we have to do a lot more work around bias training, subconscious bias, and really a lot of reflection about because we could say, I know what my biases are, but that's you've given it a moment's thought. It's really, what is the really deep thinking about what some of your really deep subconscious biases are, and we need to do that, because they're quite ugly, those things. They're there, but they're ugly, and we might want to admit them if we're woke and progressive and things like that. But I think that should be part of the set of management tools and things that we actually start using, rather than just MBAs and texts.
I think thank you for mentioning that, because we do have an unconscious bias quiz that we're running weekly to try and get people to, just trip into these things, because I think, as you say, at a moment in time when you do some unconscious bias training, it's very hard to be aware of all your unconscious biases. And that's why we're doing one different question a week, just to keep people on their toes. So a bit of fun.
I'll look that up.
So Scott, can you explain why you think this behaviour is prevalent and what can be done to avoid it?
Sure. I think that Phil's referring or mentioning, the unconscious bias is obviously the major thing at play. We grow up in a world as males, generally, depending on the community and society you're in, but we grow up in a comparably a life of privilege compared to women. That degree of privilege varies depending on what geography or community that you're in, but generally, as a broad generalisation, it is a life of privilege. The unconscious assumption, as Joe shared, in terms of meeting senior executives and non-executives, and her being assumed to be the more junior of herself and her CEO, is a reflection of that unconscious bias, that assumption. I think there's a fictional story, or whether it's real, that I was looking up the other day, trying to remember for today's session. So
about the doctor.
Yeah, and it's about a guy in the car driving his son in the car on the phone to his wife who's at work, and the car is involved in a significant car accident, and the ambulance is called by observers, and they're rushed to hospital. The son is actually in really bad shape, and in the ER, the surgeon comes out into the emergency room and attends to the boy and stands back and says, "I can't operate on this boy." And everyone in the theatre is actually saying, "Why not?" And then the answer is, "So who's this surgeon to the boy?" And I think it's been tested, might be in the UK, it might be in the US, that the vast majority of people answer that don't know what the answer is. Because and then, of course, the answer is that the surgeon is actually the boy's mother. And the number of people that were assuming that the surgeon was male is quite significant. And, and in fact, many years ago when I first heard that, guilty. I didn't realise that I was assuming the surgeon was male, but when I heard that story and it was told to me and asked who that surgeon's relationship was, I realised that I was actually assuming it was a male surgeon. So I think that's, palpable in terms of an explanation of what we have. And I think the challenge, of course, is that if you want to make change, if you want to support change, if you want to advocate change in this area, the biggest challenge is when people aren't aware of their pre-existing assumptions and their pre-existing unconscious biases. How can you make changes, even if you want to, if you can't see what needs to be changed? So for me, from a psychology perspective, from an NLP perspective, from a neurosemantics perspective, as a clinician and a qualified practitioner, we need to work on and support people in developing their self-awareness in order to actually become aware of their unconscious biases, because a cognitive class is not going to cut it, because this stuff we're talking about isn't knowledge. It's actually awareness. It's unconscious. It's not something in a book or on a whiteboard. So the work that's required is not, as Phil pointed out, not in an MBA. It's not in a formal course, so to speak, about knowledge. It's actually about self-development and self-awareness. And through advocating for that, we can support all of ourselves and others in being able to wake up to this, because only as we become aware of it can we then decide to make changes for it.
Very, very true. So now back to you, Joe. How did you handle it, and what do you do to try and prevent it from recurring?
So at that time, when we left that particular meeting, because I didn't want to embarrass anyone at the time, often it's not, I certainly don't like to walk over behaviour, but at that moment in time, it wasn't the right thing to do. But I did say to the CEO, "Did you notice what was going on there?" And the answer was yes. And I said, "So what could you have done differently?" He said, "Oh, I'm not really sure," because they were looking to me for the answer and to continue the conversation. I said, "Well, perhaps you should think about next time, if something like that occurs, that you gesture back to me or whoever it is that's actually asked the question in the first instance. And if that continues, you might also then want to verbalise that gesture." So I think, working through, the people that you're with, and like with having Scott and Phil here today, it is so important that we have our advocates by our side and we're on the same team here, and that we work with and call out that behaviour. Unfortunately, this person kind of didn't call that out, but certainly I think from thereafter did. And now, I mean, all the work I do, there's always a gender lens to that. And it's very much about the equity piece, not so much the equality, because that's a bit of a furphy, I agree. So, yeah, there's lots of, I could go on forever about that, and I won't, but there's certainly lots of things that we should, pull up and make sure that we're really clear on what those biases are.
Thanks for that, Jo. So let's move on to another topic. Let's talk a bit about encouragement bias. One of the concerns that men have raised with me is that if they're seen to praise a female staff too much, they worry that it might be misconstrued as sexual harassment. Now, Scott, in your story earlier, you had the situation that could easily have been misconstrued. Do you have a point of view about this and ideas on how things could be handled differently?
Yes, I do. But I think it's probably valuable to pre-frame the fact that I don't think there's a silver bullet to this sort of situation. As Jo started at the top of the hour, I think these are very contextually important scenarios. So rather than have a uniform answer, we might have a uniform goal in mind, but what the solution to each of them looks like and how to tackle it, I think requires a lot of intuition based on the context and the other human beings that are in the mix. So I think that in terms of, in a smaller business environment, in a smaller team, a more intimate environment, certainly what I tend to do is just to bumble through and just basically pre-frame it and say, I'm not quite sure of the answer, but let me just share with you what my intention is, what I want it to look like, and maybe you can work with me in terms of going forward. Now, that perhaps doesn't work so easily in a large organisation, a more orange or green enterprise development stage. But in terms of smaller teams, I can get away with that in terms of being able to be more personal. And depending on the person or people I'm involved with, I can actually just start at the top with saying, this is what I wanted to achieve. Will you work with me? Can we work together with this? And absolutely propagate a space of safety for everybody that's involved, so that it's okay to not get it right. It's okay to bumble and fumble, and we will support each other honestly going through that to come out the other side. Again, easier to do in smaller teams and smaller organisations. Some of the things that I've seen quite successfully done in large organisations, and certainly when I was involved in a really large company, a Fortune 500 subsidiary, the way to tackle that was to look at, rather than doing it company-wide, even from a CEO perspective, it can be quite hard to invoke that change from the top down through the entire organisation, because you'll get myriads of uptake. You'll get people that don't believe in it but are doing it, to look the part. So I find it quite interesting to look at tackling large organisations strategically and looking at departments. It should be led by the board, and they need to walk the walk and talk the talk. But I think implementing that needs to be looking at self-leadership in divisional parts of the organisation all the way through from the top to the bottom, rather than just trying to let it permeate through as if it's gravity pulling it down from the top to the bottom. I think it's really important to look at tackling it, because at each division and each level in the organisation, the goal might be the same, but how to implement it will be very, very different.
So just sort of swinging back into like encouragement bias, given that at the moment in most organisations, we've got 26% of senior leaders being female, and obviously, 74% being male. If there is an encouragement bias where men are reluctant to praise women, are we actually perpetuating, in the workplace, the reason why people, women are less likely to form that pipeline to progress? Because at the moment in most industries, we actually see a leaky pipe. You know, we've got often 50% of women at the entry level, and they go up to senior leadership level, and we're just getting a constant revolving door of women leaving and doing other things. Do you think the encouragement bias is actually real, or is it something that is perhaps just a figment of our imagination? I'm not sure. So, Scott, just your thoughts on that?
I think it is very real, Lisa. I think that, but rather than it simply being a paradigm which is the same for everybody, I think it plays out very differently depending on the situation. So there can be guys who are wanting to encourage and support, and they can either be very conscious of how that might be perceived, and that might cause them to step back and not fully lean into it. There'll be other people who will lean into it because they're fully living what they believe, perhaps not realizing how that's going to be received by others around them, and so they might go a little bit too hard, too fast. So finding the appropriate way to step through that, I think, is the key, as opposed to having a one-size-fit-all approach. And that goes again to the self-awareness, not just of oneself, but awareness of the others that are around.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that, Scott. And Jo, what are your thoughts?
I think it's, I'm all for more overtly calling out great successes of women, because they are much less likely to do it themselves. And, as long as you do it with your hands on the table, your zips up, and with genuine authenticity, then, people, I'm pretty sure, will take it on the value that it's actually intended. Yeah.
Nice. And Phil, what are your thoughts?
Well, my first thought was, here's a manager or leader that's actually giving encouragement. And in my experience, they're in the minority, not in the majority. So, we shouldn't be thinking about, oh, I'm not going to do that because I'm worried about some sort of backlash. My other thinking was as well, the amount of induction we do to new team members. We show them where the foosball table is. We show them how to access the free fruit from the staff lounge. We probably on LinkedIn, I've seen this, do an unboxing of their welcome pack, and it's brilliant. But are we inducting all new team members to myself, my management style, my communication style, and having a discussion in a way that, look, I'm an enthusiastic praiser of what you do, and this is how it might be, and give the opportunity for that staff member to then go away and then test that out with other people to see whether that's just BS or whether that's kind of genuine or not, and then just create a psychologically safe environment where if it does get problematic, that person has the safe environment in which to challenge that. So I think to come back to Scott's point, the continued going back to the intimate Italian restaurant is probably a little bit over the top, and I don't need that. And the other thing I think is, I keep coming back to this sophistication of communication. We need to get way more sophisticated about the communication we have. So I just did a course the other week about a trauma-based approach to sexual harassment investigation. And it was like, it's about learning certain phrases and practicing and actually making sure that what you're saying is going to come across as appropriate. And it's about learning a lingua franca, if you like almost by muscle memory, so that you're in a safe space. And that's the onus on us as managers and leaders to actually do that. It's not like I've just been promoted to management and I can do it on force of personality. There is a whole management science and stuff to be learned here, and a lot of it's the soft stuff. And because it's soft, it's the hard thing to do because it's soft. So the onus is on us to actually get out there and learn some of that. So I would hate to think that somebody isn't giving praise out, because we all thrive on praise, and we're all poorer for not really encouraging really good people.
Agreed. And I think that is the major concern. If we actually have organisations where people are hesitating to praise others, then that's the main reason why people go to work, to make a difference and feel good about it. So it's something that, we hope we can address with this. Let's move on to one more topic. Women are often criticised for not networking, for looking for informal interactions. Jo, you've got a point of view about the hidden systems that limit women's potential to contribute to important conversations. Can you explain what you mean?
I can. And actually, I'll perhaps paint a picture of words. So I came across this great little cartoon for International Women's Day, and I don't know who it was by, so it's certainly not my idea. I don't claim it as such. But it was a picture of a running race. And on the track, there were 8 participants, as there were, and there were 4 men on the outside and 4 women on the inside. And there's a person there with a starting gun ready to say, ready, set, go. But in front of the women were washing kids, elderly parents, project management stuff, thinking about, all that sort of stuff, right? So, and I thought, what a great visual, right? So it's such a great thing to think about. And, we have, again, biases and assumptions, and women themselves have it around their non-paid caring roles and organising roles and the family juggle, the fuggle, as we like to call it. And of course, what that does is limit your time. It limits your resources. It limits your energy, your motivation to be able to do those other extra things on top of. And therefore, women tend not to get at the action end, which then further perpetuates a myth that women don't want to be at the action end, right? So, again, more work to do in sharing, those general living practices amongst men and women.
Nice one, Jo. Phil, do you want to share your thoughts on this?
Yes, enough already with your networking. A lot of it's just rubbish. There's no networking done after 7 o'clock at night. That's the first thing. Particularly if they're outside of the workplace and they're later on into the night, where I call homosocial bonding is done. No deals, no. If you're doing a deal, a business deal, a transaction after 7 o'clock involves alcohol, the next day you got to come and unwind it all, because it probably doesn't make any sense. So it's just creating bonding, particularly between men, that has nothing to do with the success of a business. So I worked in private equity in London, and we did our fair share of outside networking and celebration of success, and we were no better for it. In fact, the next day we were pretty rough. So I think, do the networking, create space for networking in business time. So a good way might be breakfast, although they can be difficult if you're getting kids off to school, or lunches, so white ribbon lunches, all those kind of other things that you can do. And that's another way of celebrating success for that person, or encouragement, is to actually, if you want to take somebody out, take them to an event where they've got the opportunity to network with other people. So sit on the same table, sure, but sit in a different position. So you can, maybe if they're struggling a bit, you can get involved, but if not, you just let them go. So I just think there's a whole range of, we've kind of, networking has got once again, this kind of stereotype of it's done at Tattersalls, or it's done with a cigar and brandy, or whatever, amongst earnest looking men in grey suits. I notice of events that are done during the day, women are really good networkers. I really I could learn stuff here. So I think maybe we say this about women in some ways because we're actually scared of how good networkers they actually are. I think men could learn some stuff from women around networking at the moment. That's not to say that men aren't consciously, contacting one another to help their own careers, and women are probably contacting one another to support one another. But I just think we got to get rid of anything that's happening in the valley, in Brisbane, as we would say, after 7 o'clock at night, is probably better getting a taxi and going home. That's
I love it.
That's my view on networking.
I love it, Phil. But I mean, you have to admit, the bonding side of it does build relationships, and at different times, it might not be a deal, but it may very well facilitate things to happen or being, favours to be called on at later stages.
I agree, but I think it's a way for the senior leaders of organisations is why I call that homo-social contact, is to start breaking that up and say, look, it's not, it's helpful for male bonding and goes back to when you all went to the same school, but it's not. I don't think it's helpful for a business outcome.
No,
personally,
agreed.
yeah.
So Scott, what's your opinion and what else can be done?
I think Phil's suggestion about actively looking to encourage and develop opportunities for building relationships, I don't like the word networking, during work time, I think is a really good idea. Obviously, there'll be varying degrees of opportunity depending on the business type and the situation and the ecosystem that someone is in. But I think it's a really good idea because, yeah, obviously, if you're having these supposed networking events in the evening or even very early in the morning, it can prove a challenge for those of us that are primary caregivers. For example, there are plenty of other different examples as well that can. So I think it's a great idea if organisations can start to at least think about that. I also think Phil's point about sitting on a table, if you decide as a business leader to take someone and sort of sponsor them into the experience of mixing and conversing, to be able to give them the space, support them, but to give them the space to actually get some meaningful return from their heartbeats being spent at that event, as opposed to just leaving them at the door or them trotting around carrying a drink for the whole day, the whole evening. So I think they're all great ideas. Again, I think where that will come from is an increased awareness to be able to step back from yourself and to see how, I think empathy is really important, because as the business leader, be it the CEO, the chair of the board, whatever it might be, you see things through your eyes and your perspective, but your view is not the view that is shared by a junior manager or a graduate that's joined the organisation. And the assumption, whether you're aware of it or not, that what you see is what they see, what you feel is what they feel, is just plain wrong. And so being able to just be awake to that, never, the steps after that are even more complicated, but just that is the biggest awakening. The fact that we all have our own unique perspective, and 8 billion people on the planet, 8 billion subjective, unique perspectives. No two are the same. No two are the same, ever. And so just being able to be aware of that consciously, I think is the biggest step.
Agreed. I think back to Joe's point earlier too. Women are often will not intentionally allocate time to their own professional development. They'll allow all the other things to take precedence. And so I think having some intentional time where you want to go and build relationships with different people to potentially further your career or help you do better with your business or career or whatever is something that women often won't allocate. But Joe, what are your thoughts on overcoming this barrier?
Look, I think really you raise a great point there, Lisa. You've actually got to really overtly invest in doing it. You've got to plan it into the schedule. It's like, making sure you get your daily exercise and those sorts of things. If you actually don't plan it in, it doesn't happen. I personally don't love great big events. I don't think they're particularly good for the purposes that we're talking about, but I certainly think making time to have deliberate conversations with either one-on-one or in small groups, have a target, have an objective. How many do I need? How many people should I be seeing each month? And, where is it going to make sense? How is it going to be a win-win partnership approach, so that you're not just going from coffee to coffee, wine to wine, or whatever that thing might be. And again, I think women really need to value their time and also invest in themselves financially. So even if it means, investing in the things that you're not emotionally involved or stuck on, like for me, it was taking the kids to school. hated taking the kids to school. So I'd get somebody in for 2 hours every morning so that I could go in early and have those conversations, set myself up for the day. And for me, that was really worthwhile. So whatever that is for you that makes a difference, go forth and make it happen.
Thank you for that. What a fabulous discussion. Hopefully you've learned a whole lot more about why communication biases continue. It's clearly a very complex topic in the workplace, and sometimes there's some simple roadmaps that each one of the panelists has shared that you can implement, and other times you need to appreciate that there's just a lot of different perspectives and everybody's human and different. If you want to be recognised as a male ally and receive access to some of this information, the tools and roadmaps, and please have a look at Business and Heals and join. As I mentioned today, we have the unconscious bias quiz going every week, and I think Kirsten popped a link out there, and it's on Business and Mentoring. A huge thank you to our panelists, Joe Plummer, Phil Diver, and Scott Brown for sharing their experience and ideas. Thank you all.
Thanks everyone. Great to chat.